All right. Mike from Turn Leftist is here. I'm Chris Jeffries, homeless romantic. This is Caleb Maupin, uh, the one and only. So, what's the weather like in Brooklyn right now?
Well, it's a nice summer day. It's warm. It was rainy before, but it's not rainy now. It's nice and sunny. So there you go. What about
You're
where are
not.
you guys located?
I am in exile. I'm actually in Germany. So no, I'm not in exile. I'm
Mhm.
actually. I got out of there. I got the hell out of Dodge while I could. So I'm in Germany, but I'm from Colorado originally.
Okay.
Mike, where are you hailing from?
I'm also in New York, same as Caleb, but just in a very far away part. I'm about 7 hours from you, near Buffalo. So
Oh, wow. Up by the
same
Canadian
weather as
border.
you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. You been doing any traveling recently? I know that you get around a bit.
Well, I was in Chicago, meeting with some of my people out there. I've done some international travel. I was at the World Youth Festival in Russia in March, and I was an election observer in Russia. I got an opportunity to speak with the Russian president. That was pretty cool.
Cool.
So, yeah, that was my last big trip. I get around, as you said.
Well, now I just got to ask you, how was that talking to the president? Tell me a story. That's
Well,
spicy.
it was neat, to be in the room at this gathering of people from all over the world, people from Vietnam, people from China, people from various African countries, to be in a room with these people from around the world that are part of this new economy that is emerging, centered around the BRICS countries. It was pretty neat. Different ideas, high achieving young people, the top scorers in mathematics, some of the top athletes from these various developing countries who all kind of see Russia and China as the future, and to be in the room and then have the Russian president there come and do a long Q&A with us. That was pretty cool.
Wow. And what was your cue?
Well, I was scheduled to do question number 3, so I got up and I talked to him about how U.S. relations with Russia are not good, what could happen to improve things, and he gave kind of a long answer. He praised the United States for some of our achievements, but he also talked about the unilateral approach, the way the USA talked about the end of history after the fall of the Soviet Union, the unilateral invasion of Iraq. And he made a comparison. He said, look, the USA invades a country on the other side of the world, falsely claiming that they have weapons of mass destruction. We're dealing with a situation on our border. Someone's right on our border. There's been a conflict going on in that country for year after year after year. People are dying. If one is okay, the other clearly is. I thought that was an interesting way of putting it. But yeah, if the USA can unilaterally invade Iraq, why can Russia not move in to protect the peoples of the Donbass region after they've been dying since 2014? I often reference that monument, the Alley of Angels, that has all the children who died in the Donetsk People's Republic and Lugansk and other places. People make it sound like this war started when the special military operation began, but it started in 2014 when the USA toppled the Ukrainian government, and there was a peace treaty, the Minsk Agreement, that was supposed to improve things, and they waited 8 years for the Minsk Agreement to be implemented, and it wasn't. And that whole time there were food blockades, people were dying, and Russia finally moved in to protect the people of the eastern regions. That's what the Ukraine war is really about, and it's pretty obvious if you look into it, and U.S. media works very, very hard to obscure that.
Isn't that the truth? Well, also it actually goes back even further to the IMF loans that they gave out as soon as the Soviet Union collapsed. And they said, well, hey, we're going to help you rebuild and everything. And immediately got them into that cycle of debt and, torture, mayhem, and chaos that the IMF can bring.
Yeah, just a couple of minutes ago on this stream, we were watching the Venezuelan Attorney General drawing a direct comparison between Venezuela, the Arab Spring, and Euromaidan. It's the exact same playbook in every situation.
That's interesting. Yeah, well, the fall of the Soviet Union was a devastating event, economically speaking. They imposed radical free market reforms, just ripped apart the state-run economy, mass unemployment at like 30% unemployment, which is like an insane amount of unemployment. The factories closed their doors, the farms shut down. Russia was economically suffering. And Putin, got Russia in a better spot by restructuring the economy around oil and gas and putting oil and gas under the control of a state corporation, the Gazprom for the natural gas, Rosneft for the oil. And that's, the revenue from their oil and gas. That's how they, were able to subsidize the reindustrialization of the country. And they've done a lot to improve things. Their farming sector is exploding. Russia has really gotten a lot stronger under Putin's leadership. And when they were down for the count and suffering in the 90s, that's when the USA loved Russia. But once Russia restored itself and, became a competitor, became a strong country economically once again, that's when all of a sudden we started hearing about the Russian threat.
Of course. We don't want competitors. We want slaves in this sense. So what can you tell me about the increase of standard of living in Russia over the last 2 decades or so?
Well, I believe in Putin's first term, the wages of the average Russian tripled. Now, there was a lot of inflation during that time, so it wasn't like they got 3 times what they had, but it was a very significant increase. They restored their industrial base to what it had been at the time of the fall of the USSR. They started repopulating. During the 90s and the early 2000s, they were, losing their population. I believe between the time of the fall of the Soviet Union and 2006, Russia's population went down by roughly 10%. Now, it's not just people dying, people leaving the country, et cetera. But I mean, that's a 10% drop in your population. I mean, that was not good. But then their population started rising once again. In fact, I know a lot of people that are moving there. People from around the world, from African countries, from South America are moving there. Russia's population is rising. Their economy is getting stronger. Their farming sector is booming. I mean, they're back in good shape. And I have to point out I actually, I get along with a lot of libertarians because they're against the low wage police state that we're facing here in the United States, and they're against these wars. But when it comes to economics, they're just wrong because they had the free market neoliberal policies in the 90s. And it was a disaster. And the way they fixed it was reasserting state control, having the state, oversee the economy in order to ensure economic growth, right? And that's what Putin has been all about. He wrote his college thesis about how oil and gas and natural resources could be used to stabilize the Russian economy. And it looks like around the time of the fall of the Soviet Union, the Soviet leaders were trying to do that to some degree or other. They built a pipeline to connect to Germany, and then the Reagan administration worked with Saudi Arabia to drop the oil prices. And, there was some understanding at the time of the fall of the Soviet Union that might be a way they could transition their economy. But then the Soviet Union fell, and that got put on hold. But then when Putin was reelected, he was able to kind of implement what he talked about in his academic thesis of rescuing their economy by restructuring it around public oil and gas.
And I always ask people, because when I want to know about something intimate about the Soviet Union, I wanted to ask you specifically, why were they all mixed up in Afghanistan? Why? And that was seemed like one of the nails in the coffin.
Well, we now know that it was intentional. Zbigniew Brzezinski called it the Afghan trap. Afghanistan was on the border of the Soviet Union, very Muslim, very underdeveloped, impoverished country. And it was a monarchy that was neutral between the United States and the Soviet Union. And a lot of people in the military were members of the Soviet-aligned party. It wasn't called the Communist Party. It was called the People's Democratic Party, right? And a lot of people in the military had gotten military training in the Soviet Union, et cetera. And they were part of this political party that was a legal part of the system there called the People's Democratic Party. Zbigniew Brzezinski now admits that he worked with the monarchy there to launch a huge crackdown on these members of the military and others that were in the People's Democracy Party. So they were forced to have a coup in order to prevent being killed. And so the military toppled the monarchy and they broke their comrades out of jail. They tore down the walls of the jail, and the People's Democracy Party was forced to take power prematurely. Most of the population in the countryside didn't really like the People's Democracy Party because they were secular, and Afghanistan, a very religious and a very underdeveloped, very rural country. So the People's Democracy Party took power prematurely. And Zbigniew Brzezinski was the national security advisor to Ronald Reagan. He comes out of Columbia University, the Center for Communist Studies. He was, he's one of the Cold War strategists. He admitted later that his plan was to give the Soviet Union their Vietnam. And he called it the Afghan trap. And so almost immediately after the People's Democracy Party is forced to come to power to prevent being killed, they come to power. And then with the help of a wealthy young Saudi named Osama bin Laden, the United States starts pouring weapons into the rural areas and recruiting Muslims from all over the world to go into Afghanistan and wage a holy war against the infidels, against these atheist communists who've taken power. And the Soviet Union sees that right on their border. And then you have to remember that, the Soviet Union has dealt with Islamist kind of insurgencies before in Chechnya, in other places. During the Second World War, there were various Muslim groups that were aligned with Hitler and such. So, they don't want Afghanistan to turn into a center of like Islamic terrorism against the Soviet Union. And that government, those generals that they had trained, the people who led the People's Democracy Party, they were supposed to, they had their back. They had a relationship. So the Soviet Union sent its troops in to protect the elected and legitimate government of Afghanistan. And the USA worked with Pakistan and the security services in Pakistan to arrange for heroin dealers and all kinds of stuff, and money and drugs and weapons flowed into Afghanistan. And there was a really ugly war. And I understand the death count is in the millions. That war kept going. What's interesting is after the Soviet Union fell, Soviet Union fell in 1991, the People's Democratic Government, the People's Democracy Party, held out for a few more years. I believe they were in power until like 1993, showing that they had a very significant base of popular support. They weren't just Soviet puppets. And even with the Soviet Union gone, they held out for quite some time before they were ultimately defeated. The Taliban, from what I understand, was a faction of the anti-Soviet forces. They were like one faction. That then took power, the more radical, conservative Islamic force. But yeah, the Soviet Union was kind of cornered into a situation where they felt they had to move their forces into Afghanistan. And then the USA prolonged that conflict as long as they could. They boycotted the Olympics in 1980. They used it. They rallied the world. The Soviet Union is invading Afghanistan. They arranged the whole thing. It was very strategic. Make the Soviets look like the bad guy. The USA was reeling from the defeat in Vietnam. And a big aspect of why the USA was defeated in Vietnam was optics, that people around the world sympathized with the Vietnamese, these peasants that are fighting for their homeland against a mighty empire. And they figured the best way to defeat the Soviets is to co-opt those communist aesthetics, those communist optics of the peasant army fighting the invaders, make the Soviets into the bad guys. And I mean, CBS News was caught airing fake staged battle footage. I mean, the Pentagon, they like had people dress in costumes and they filmed them. And CBS News was caught filming it. The Columbia School of Journalism revealed this, and that it was very much a made-for-TV war. You watch The Living Daylights, the James Bond movie where the Mujahideen are the heroes. I think there's one of the Rambo movies, with Sylvester Stallone, and that they did everything they could to take the propaganda aesthetics that the communists had used in Vietnam and turn them on their head against the Soviet Union. It was very effective. One thing that I often will point to about this, there's a book called Afghanistan, Washington's Secret War by Philip Bonosky, who was a reporter from the United States who was in Afghanistan. He talked about when the Soviet Union moved its troops into Afghanistan, there was only one tank in Kabul, the capital city. It was in the park. And all the Western TV cameras surrounded this one tank because that was the image that Western media had decided to use for Soviet, military interventions, right? The tank, right? The tank is this cold mechanical piece of machinery. It's not a person, doesn't have a face, there's no politics. And whenever the Soviet Union moved its forces into any country, Western media would just show a bunch of big, scary tanks. And then you remember 1989, Tiananmen Square, this guy holding a flag in front of a tank. And it was, communism was this cold mechanical tank, and anti-communism was human rights and individuals. It was brilliant marketing. It was brilliant propaganda strategy.
We're still doing it now with Ukraine.
Yeah, they're still doing it.
Yeah. And I mean, you asked about the Soviet Union went into Afghanistan. I mean, that's your answer. They got cornered into it. And I'm sure that everything I'm saying now is known by Russian government officials, and they've studied this, and they're trying to make sure they don't get trapped in the same way. I think that's probably the intent of the Biden administration. There's a weird parallel between Joe Biden and Jimmy Carter, right? Jimmy Carter was this president who came in. He was a peanut farmer. Oh, you're upset. It's going to be okay. I wear a sweater instead of turning up the heat in the wintertime. It's so nice, and I'm going to meet with gays and feminists at the White House, and I'm
That is so fucking good. That
Yeah, that was Jimmy Carter, right? And it was
Carter
to
also
make,
doesn't get enough credit for being like the Reagan of his time too. Like he was doing Reaganism before Reagan, and he gets no credit for it because Reagan did it so much worse. But I kind of wanted to bring you back, Caleb, to a little more about the modern conditions of Russia, if we could, because I had some questions regarding like the cultural aspect. Like I know you pointed out before, a lot of people are moving to Russia. People who are like in the know about like the financial and social welfare aspects of Russia, like just the cost of living, like you were saying, it's actually much better than what people, because people what do you call it? Like their point of view here in the US is very much based in like the early 90s. They still think of Russia as some like, remember that movie Euro Trip when they go to Eastern Europe and everybody's like super impoverished and they're like making fun of like all of Eastern Europe post Soviet collapse? It's like for a long time, yeah, shit was bad. Like that's why they have notable stereotypes for sex trafficking and all kinds of impoverishment. But this is not 30 years ago. We are not in that same world. And now there's like development in a lot of places in Eastern Europe, and particularly in Russia. And I noticed that the propaganda that comes out, like one of the best known cases of people who moved to Russia from the US was a family who was like pro-Trump, like hardcore conservatives, very like anti-LGBTQ. And it was a big news story that like they moved their 8 kids over to Russia because it was going to be culturally better for them. They viewed it as like a hardcore Christian traditionalist country, and they felt that they would be at home there, and then immediately regretted it and wanted to go back. And it was this big news story, and it all just felt like absolute propaganda to me. And so I wonder, like, if you've been to Russia, like, do you get the impression that they are this like hardcore traditional Christian nationalist country that really hates gay people, and that's why the US wants to fight them, and it has nothing to do with all these economic and materialist issues? Like, what's your impression of the cultural aspect?
That's a
there's
long
gay
question.
nightclubs and stuff in Russia. I will say that, the Russian people are deeply conservative, right? I mean, that they've, for thousands of years, and there's a lot of Muslims in Russia, but it's not a majority, but it's a Christian country historically. And during the time of the Soviet Union, even in the Soviet period, Trotsky and his attack on the Soviet Union, he wrote, Revolution Betrayed. He has a section called The Thermidor in the Family, and he talks about how Stalin kind of reverted to some very traditional, he had the Soviet family. Before we had the nuclear family in the United States, you had the Soviet family. And it was like a mother and a father, and they gave medals to women who had more than 10 children. And that the Soviet Union was like this weird kind of compromise between the deeply conservative Russian peasantry and the very far left, Bolsheviks, right? And it was this kind of compromise that worked. And Stalin was himself from a rural village in Georgia, and he'd been a seminary student before he became a communist. He was studying to be a priest. And that, the Soviet Union itself was kind of conservative in a way that a lot of Western leftists don't understand and can't relate to. And that, I think that, there are gay people in Russia, there are gay nightclubs and all that, but especially since, there has been so much of an effort from the United States to destabilize Russia. And a big part of that has been funding like protests by the rich kids. I mean, there's no other way to put it. The wealthiest, most privileged people in the country who have, one of these and are looking, on their phone, are looking on Twitter and Facebook and all of that, and believe the Western stuff, getting them to go out and riot under the leadership of Navalny and all of that. And a lot of them are very, very, sexual and interested
in about Navalny.
interested in the LGBT whatever. And a lot of these NGOs that are fighting for LGBT rights in Russia, supposedly, they're not concerned about helping gay people in Russia. They're trying to destabilize Russia. They're trying to overthrow the Russian government for the United States, and they're using that as an issue. And so the homosexual propaganda law, some of the laws about NGO funding, I see that as Russia trying to protect itself. But that said, I will mention this, right? So I am neutral. My organization, the Center for Political Innovation, is pretty much neutral on social issues, right? We have people in our group that are gay. We have people in our group who say that, being gay is a violation of their religious faith, whether they're Muslims or Christians or whatever. I just don't want to talk about that. I didn't become a communist or a socialist to talk about what people do in their bedrooms. I just didn't do that, right? I want to talk about... I want to talk about class struggle. I want to talk about economics. I want to talk about opposing imperialism. But there was, especially starting during the Obama years, there became this demand in left-wing circles in the United States that every meeting starts with pronouns, and if you aren't completely on board with that, you're a bad person. And I have women friends who have concerns about women's sports. Oh, bad people, canceled. I have, I have religious folks that say, look, if people want to do that, but my religious teaching that I'm going to raise my kids with says otherwise, oh, they're bad people, they're bigots. And it just became, you must focus on that issue all the time. Well, a lot of people in the developing world, a lot of working class people look at that and they say, I'm not comfortable with that. And I don't feel like making that a demand is really healthy. And I will say, though, I don't appreciate the other extreme, right? I want everyone to feel welcome. And if somebody is of a different lifestyle, I want them to be welcome in the group. I want them to feel that they can be accepted. I feel like it's a trap. They want us talking about these cultural issues because there's no room for compromise or education on them, right? Nobody who is, pro-choice says, oh, a fetus is alive. No one says that, right? Nobody who's, against or gay marriage says, marriage, you never change your mind. These are deeply held cultural beliefs that you're not going to change with rational, logical arguments. Maybe a person's view on it might change based on their life circumstances, right? Where if they move to a new area, have a new job, or part of a new community, they might change their views. But these are not arguments that can be resolved with rational debate. And so it's very convenient for the elite to focus on those issues, right? And to polarize the country around those kinds of issues because it's very convenient, and it's a way to make sure there's really no unity. And I will say, I was kind of canceled in communist circles for saying that we should just talk about other things. And then some people came along who sounded a lot like me at first, and then they went in the complete opposite direction, and they just want to pander very hard to socially conservative people. And I have stayed exactly where I am, which is I want to talk about economics. I want to talk about class struggle. That's what I'm about, right?
Well, can I ask you, Caleb?
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, so you said you're involved with this what was it, the CPA? What does that stand for again?
The Center for Political Innovation, cpiusa.org. That's our organization. It's an education project. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Because I would be curious, like, what org you were affiliated with, that you were traveling for. Because we had recently Eddie Lagersmith on from the American Communist Party. And I think in the past, like, you had been associated with orgs that got labeled either patriotic socialists or MAGA communists. And I was wondering, like, if you want to clarify what your stance is on that, because I think that's probably who you're referring to when you talk about people who cater to the socially conservative people. We had our beef with Eddie the other day about, like, if the American Communist Party is part of, like, considers itself MAGA communist, patriotic socialist, if there's a bunch of, like, LGBT or homophobes or transphobes in the organization, and if they cater to that. And their messaging was more like, or at least Eddie's was that used to be a part of, like, what the HAS and infrared people were doing. They've reformed out of that, and it seemed like, for better or worse, I can tell it, or as much as I can tell, that it seems like a genuine kind of direction that they're taking to be more inclusive, if not, like, center everything around it. So would you say that, like, your stance is just that, like, it's not relevant to your org, you consider yourself just, like, purely centered on economics, or what?
Well, first of all, I mean, where to begin? There's so much that could be said. And there's also, I want to be careful because, again, part of the distraction is making this all about personalities and drama and all that. And I don't want to do that. And but I will say, first of all, there's no such thing as patriotic socialism. The Communist Party was always a patriotic organization when it was strong. The position was socialism would make a better country, right? And that, the little red book, Mao, he says there is no contradiction between patriotism and internationalism. If you love your country, you should want the best for the world and want it to get along with the rest of the world. If you love the rest of the world, you should want your country to prosper and be part of that world. And that patriotism is different than national chauvinism, right? There's this phrase that I used to hear a lot. I don't hear it so much anymore, which is interesting. But Americans go around, this is the greatest country in the world. This is the greatest country in the world. Well, that's not a nice way to talk, right? We shouldn't be boastful. We shouldn't be comparing ourselves. And so, putting down other countries, wanting your country to gain at the expense of other countries, that's something I've always rejected. But patriotism just means you want the best for the country you live in. And communists and socialists have always been patriots. And, especially during the Popular Front years, during the anti-fascist period of Roosevelt and et cetera, there was a real emphasis on saying, that America's best democratic traditions, communists are the inheritors of, and that, Abraham Lincoln had a communist general in the Union Army, a guy named August Willich. Roosevelt met with communist organizers at the White House. The Soviet Union and the United States teamed up to defeat the Nazis during World War II. There's a lot in our country. Yes, there's obviously ugly racism and Jim Crow and murder of Native people. And we shouldn't be proud of any of that. And we shouldn't gloss over any of it. But at the same time, there has been a history of progressive struggle in this country. Union organizers and people fighting for the rights of Black people and people standing up against wars like Eugene Debs and all of that. And that if socialism ever comes to America, it would be that side of America, that progressive, optimistic side that celebrates growth and innovation, as well as human rights and advancing people's livelihood and civil liberties, et cetera, that empowers people. That would be that coming to power. And that's all I ever said. And that got labeled in around like 2017, 2018, that was labeled, quote unquote, patriotic socialism. And myself and Peter Coffin, and we're very close. Peter Coffin's a member of our organization. We just went out there and we said, look, we're patriots. And there's actually a great essay by Lenin talking about how he was patriotic to the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire was a prison house of nations, but he was patriotic to it because he said, look, as much as we don't want any nation to be oppressed, we are loyal to our homeland and we're proud to be Russian. And we're not, we oppose World War I, but we're not anti-Russia, right? We love Russia, right? And Lenin made that point about, a country he called a prison house of nations. So all socialism has always been patriotic. Now, Peter Coffin and myself and CPI, when we were first founded, before any of these other people came along, we were widely attacked for that. And it was, we were white supremacists and neo-Nazis and all this. And it's like, no, we're not. Like I was going to court with police brutality victims before Black Lives Matter was ever tweeted. When I lived in Cleveland in 2010, I was profiled, the communist next door in Cleveland Scene magazine. My wife is a longtime immigrant activist who I met through doing immigrant activism in support of immigrant communities. Like, I have always been an anti-racist, but I did say that if we really want to win, we need to start making clear we don't want to destroy our country. And so that was labeled, became this whole thing, patriotic socialism. Now, we formed CPI. Some of these other people came around. We had a big kind of rally in Austin, Texas, where some of these other people were there. Then after that, these people came up with MAGA communism, which I never really embraced it. Okay. I mean, my feeling was that the idea that we need to engage with the kind of people who are Trump supporters about communism, that I agree with. But as far as a brand, it's really not strategic. Because
it seems like such a contradiction, right?
Yeah, anyone who's MAGA hates communists. Anyone who's a communist hates MAGA. So it's like it is designed to be the most niche, narrow thing. It's, not strategic, but I like the idea. And I did write a book, Marxism, MAGA, and the Coming Revolution. Where is America going? Kind of getting into how the rise of Trump and the divisions in the ruling class and all of that. So I didn't completely, it's not like I didn't react to MAGA communism the way most of the woke people did with, oh, how dare, we condemn this. But these folks that had kind of started out orbiting around me and were paying attention to me, they went in this wildly social conservative direction. They use very, very nasty, mean-spirited language. And they've also targeted me on a personal level, not even a political level. They've brought up all kinds of nasty gossip about me. And I actually was on the phone with somebody from the American Communist Party today, and they made it clear they want absolutely no relationship with the Center for Political Innovation or with me. So that pretty much settles it. We have no beef with them. I mean, I don't appreciate what some of the people that are in that organization have said about me and the way that they've, specifically targeted me and made life hard for me and others and people I'm close to. But, I have no beef with them, but they want nothing to do with us. So be it. That's what
is that just like an ideological split?
No, I think it's purely personal. I think,
personal.
yeah, and that, I don't want to say more. If I say more, and that's the problem, right?
All right.
Every time I engage or
that's
talk
fine.
about these individuals, there's
right.
a wave of nasty personal attacks that follow, and I'm disappointed that they have that attitude, because I think those of us who really do want a better America, we should be cooperating with each other.
I mean, it seems like you would be ideologically then aligned. Like, that's why I was asking if it was an ideological, like what that distinction would be. But if it is purely personal, that seems like it's a shame, because it seems like your organization and the ACP are like right in lockstep, right?
Yeah. And there is an effort to say that it's coming from me, that I'm hostile to them. Well, again, I don't appreciate what some people have done, but we have been open to reconciliation. And there was finally a phone call today. And on that phone call, it was made clear to me over and over and over again over the course of a half-hour phone call, they do not want any relationship with us. So
maybe this will get back to them that
the hostility is coming from me is completely wrong. So,
since you're being so magnanimous about it, maybe this will get back to them, and then we can patch things up from there. But Chris, did you have something?
I don't think so. And the thing is, our organization CPI, we have actually started to move away from the word communist, not because our beliefs have changed, but because to most, it used to be when I would tell people in America I was a communist, they would be
In
like,
favor
how
of
could
what
you,
though?
what, well,
How
let me-
could you
let
do
me
that?
finish. How could you ever be that? Right. You know, and I could tell them. Now, if I tell people I'm a communist, they think I have pink hair and that I think all Trump supporters are Nazis and I'm obsessed with the trans thing. That's not me. Right. And we want to actually recruit average people who would never go looking for these ideas. And we are also aligned. You know, I attended the Libertarian Party convention. I have a relationship with a church that is very supportive of peace with North Korea and help make the peace talks happen between Trump and Kim Jong-un, and that we are trying to align ourselves with forces that want peace in the world, like the Libertarian Party, like others. And those forces are very put off by the word communist because they associate it with wokeism. And the average people that we're trying to recruit as we knock on doors and all of that, they're kind of off put by it. And the word communism, it almost kind of attracts very contrarian people, right? Unfortunately, right? I consider what I'm doing to be the purest interpretation of you know, anti-imperialism, et cetera. But unfortunately, it kind of attracts contrarian people, and that, you know, engaging in some kind of battle to own that word, I just don't see as a productive use of my time. We are the Center for Political Innovation, and we recently decided to start calling ourselves innovationists, because the essence of communism is a celebration of technology and human development. And it is the belief that humans are constantly moving to a higher mode of production, that unlike any other species, we can reinvent our relationship with nature. And the ultimate goal, you know, communism, as Karl Marx explained it, is a vast state of abundance, right? It means there's so much wealth that has been generated, the very need for a state fades away, et cetera. Socialism is the road getting there because it lifts the artificial restraints on human development that have been imposed by the rule of the market, right? You know, under this system, people are homeless because there are too many houses. People are hungry because there's too much food. Andrew Yang wrote about how self-driving cars under this system would lead to riots in the streets and mass unemployment, because every truck driver and every traffic court employee would be out of a job. That's not rational, right? Human technology should advance and we should become wealthier as a result. And that is so much of what Marx was writing about, that human innovation and technological advancement should lead to greater prosperity. Under capitalism, it doesn't do that. So we need a rationally organized economy so we can have growth. And that's, you know, when Deng Xiaoping came to power after the end of the Cultural Revolution, he said, poverty is not socialism, but to be rich is glorious. And the communist countries during the Cold War, they were surrounded, they were attacked, millions were killed in Korea, millions were killed in Vietnam, millions died in the Soviet Union. They were surrounded, they were barricaded. And so they fell into kind of the trap of trying to create an egalitarian society in poverty, which we've learned through the course of the 20th century, that is not possible. You cannot create a society that is egalitarian in poverty. The road to equality is abundance. When there's enough for everybody, then there's no need for somebody to be more than anybody else. There's no need to hoard. And that if you fall into the trap of trying to create equality in poverty, you're kind of doomed. And the Cultural Revolution in China was a disaster. Che Guevara, I admire his heroism as a great anti-imperialist leader, but if you go to Cuba, they will tell you his economic policies in the 1960s, the early 60s, were not successful. He tried to build socialism without material incentives, et cetera. It didn't work out too well. That socialism is implementing a rationally planned economy so you can have growth. And I also want to mention part of the reason that we're calling ourselves innovationists is because, you know, wokeism, and I talked about this in my book on Kamala Harris, wokeism is like all the bad things about the original communism separated and concentrated. It has nothing to do with planned economy, it's nothing to do with working class, et cetera. It's just kind of that spirit of rebellion, that spirit of rage, you know, that idea that change always comes through a confrontation, et cetera. It's that is what wokeism really is. It's like all the negative aspects of communism.
Liberal utopianism, maybe?
Yeah, and what we want to do is we want to take the good, right? You know, the understanding of an economy, the celebration of human technological advancement, anti-imperialism, and the understanding about how imperialism, capitalism in its monopoly stage keeps country in poverty and holds back development. And that if you go to communist countries now, I was in Russia, I've been to Venezuela, I've been to Nicaragua. You know, if you go to communist countries, they're not encouraging people to go out and struggle with each other and tear each other down. They're trying to create a sense of oneness and community. Right.
I did want to ask you if you could give your take on Chinese billionaires, because that was the first time that I had ever seen you go viral online, was when you had defended the concept of them and said that China was still socialist despite having them. And I wanted to see if you could give your, like, just in layman's terms, your take on that.
Well, I think the reason that I went out on that is because for me, realizing that communism, the higher stage of communism, is based on vast abundance, that was a huge revelation for me when I was studying Marxist economics. I had always thought it was just like, oh, we have socialism and we teach everyone to be good and everyone learns to be good and then they're just good. And that doesn't make sense. But when it was explained that capitalism holds back development and that communism lays the basis for eradicating scarcity, right? And that we want so much wealth that scarcity vanishes. And that's the way we can have a stateless and classless world. That was a huge revelation for me. So when I heard AOC and others saying we want to abolish billionaires, I thought that's not the right message, right? We want everyone to be a billionaire. We want there to be so much wealth that the very need for the state can fade away. And on top of that, I know a lot of American working class people who really do believe that communism is about taking what they have. People who've worked hard their whole life to have a nice car or a nice house or to provide for their kids or enable their kids to go to college. And in their minds, communism is the government coming and taking that away. That's what a lot of Americans have been told communism is, and that's why they would oppose it. I would oppose such a thing if I thought that's what it was. And so the phrase abolish billionaires, it reeks of the idea that we are against wealth. We're not against wealth, we're against inequality. We're against exploitation, right? We're against wealth that's created by making other people poor. And that point needs to be raised. And that kind of goes against what a lot of people think. People think that communism is the redistribution of wealth. But if you read Critique of the Goethe Program, Marx makes very clear it's not about redistribution of wealth. It's about changing property relations and the way wealth is created so that wealth and growth can just expand indefinitely and we can eradicate scarcity. So, I mean, Chinese billionaires exist, and they exist as part of their overall state centrally planned economy. And that doesn't make China not socialist, because at the end of the day, the economy is still, organized in order to serve public good and not the profits of a wealthy few. And those billionaires exist at the whim of the Communist Party. And actually, China and Iran are the only two countries in the world where a billionaire has ever gotten the death penalty. Because the billionaires, they exist, but they don't have the power, right? They exist at the whim of the party. And so that's where I was making that point. And that's why we're calling ourselves innovationists. People think communism is anti-wealth. We're not. People think communists worship poverty. We don't. Right. And so that's, this innovationist turn. My views haven't changed. But in order to have this conversation with people, we need to kind of change. And also, saying you're a communist in America, it's like saying you're a devil worshiper. It's like it doesn't mean anything. So why create that barricade, especially when there are people now, there's a big scramble of who gets to own the word, who gets to be the boss, who gets to own communism. I have no desire to win that.
This is my thing. I don't adopt the name. I have Mike on. Mike's fervently says he's communist. He stamps it on everything, but I'm secretly, I'm with it, but at the same time, I'm not trying to paint myself into a corner with certain phrases, and innovations. Yeah. Everybody likes innovations. Come on. That's good.
Let me also point this out too, which is after the fall of the Soviet Union, global communism changed, right? The Soviet way of doing things is never coming back, right? I mean, there are socialist communist governments around the world, Vietnam, North Korea, Cuba, China, but they openly want to be more like China. They want to have a market sector. They've kind of learned from the fall of the Soviet Union. Also, even during the Cold War, you had Ba'athist Arab socialism, and Ba'athist Arab socialism was, the Soviet Union said this is socialism. They called it a socialist oriented government, Iraq and Syria, but it was not Marxist-Leninist. And a big moment for me was the Green Book, Gaddafi, right? 2011, Gaddafi, I mean, he had done so much to raise people out of poverty, and he was such a great anti-imperialist, had stood with the Black Panthers and the Palestinians and the IRA and so many great people. And what happened in Libya, Gaddafi said he wasn't a communist. He said he was an Islamic socialist. And the first book CPI ever published was the Green Book.
He's got it on hand, folks.
We have many copies of it on hand because this book by Gaddafi is a great socialist book.
The Green Book is great. He really loves his community councils.
I'll check it out, you guys. You communist guys, you're always teaching me everything I ever wanted to know.
Yeah, but Gaddafi was not a Marxist-Leninist, right? And I feel like, Marx, the classic Soviet-style Marxism-Leninism, it laid the foundation. It's the understanding of what imperialism is. It's the understanding of how to organize an economy. But the anti-imperialist world has learned from that and incorporated a lot of it, but it's also moved on. I will also say that I am a Christian and I do believe in God, right? And I think that you cannot build God's kingdom on earth without God, right? And that the idea that communism as a movement emerged in the period where feudalism was being overthrown. And in feudalism, religion is not a choice. It is imposed. And it is the church that says the landowner owns the land and you must obey the landowner. And so rebellion against religion was a very big part of the struggle to bring down feudalism. And it makes sense. And if the church is propping up a very hierarchical and oppressive institution, but now in our Western society, religion is very much a choice. And it's a choice that the ruling class, the billionaires and stuff, don't want us to make. They very much say, if you believe in God, you're brainwashed, you're in a cult, you need to be controlled, right? And they very much are trying to get people to believe there is no hope, there is no truth, there is no purpose. And religiousness is a big part of communism, especially in Latin America. Maduro is Roman Catholic, very religious. In Nicaragua, I attended Pentecostal church services that are all about socialism and the Sandinistas. In the Muslim world, the resistance to imperialism is led by Shia Muslims. Largely, they're the center. And that getting people to live for the sake of others and live for a higher purpose is almost an essential part of what it means to be an anti-imperialist in our time. Whereas, the West is promoting this kind of pessimistic, nihilistic atheism. When Richard Dawkins and all of them came out, they called them the new atheists, because they were substantially different than previous atheists. The word atheist comes out of the French Revolution, and it was a rebellion against the Catholic Church and against feudalism, and it was associated with communism. But, Ayn Rand and her, I think she called Christianity the guilt-peddling Jesus industry. And her critique of Christianity is that it would make you want to have compassion, make you want to think about other people. She talked about the virtue of selfishness. This is the atheism that our ruling class believes in. It's philosophical irrationalism. It is Friedrich Nietzsche, etc. And that atheism is basically the religion of Western capitalism and imperialism. And I am opposed to that. And I see increasingly the people around the world that are resisting it in the name of some kind of religious faith. So I've talked along. I'm sorry. You get me talking.
Well, Caleb.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Chris.
Well, I just was going to say, reclaiming religion for what it was actually supposed to be and saying, turn the other cheek, help the poor, et cetera, et cetera. I love it. The same reason that I had the MAGA, or let's say Eddie Lager Smith, come on with, if they're draping themselves in American flags and trying to reclaim the American symbology of it, I'm all for it. If you can get the niche support, of these narrow demographic, then all power to you. But in the case of religion and communism, dude, hook it together, interlink it, make it happen, bro.
Yeah, Alexander Dugin. Oh, go ahead, please.
Well, go make your Dugin point first.
Oh, well, Alexander Dugin is an important thinker in Russia. I met with him in 2018. And, he had this concept of the fourth political theory, and he talks about liberalism versus illiberalism, right? And I think that increasingly politics around the world is starting to line up that way, of liberalism versus illiberalism. It's not left versus right. There is illiberalism of the left and illiberalism of the right, but they kind of line up against liberalism, which is the Western ideology. That's all I was going to say.
Go ahead, Mike.
Well, I was curious. I've said on stream a couple of times that my personal take is that all the religions and the political ideologies are trying as best as they can with the conditions at hand to get people back to some kind of state in which they were more naturally existing before, I guess, capitalism was foisted upon all of us, and hopefully get us back to some kind of system of values that works with human nature, whatever that would be, more like the species being version of it, not like the traditional, liberalist version of that, but something that would be like a system of values that would adapt to every material changing conditions, that it wouldn't matter, if we had different environmental collapses or whatever. Like if you just had a universal system of values that people could follow, and that's what the religions are doing. So I guess, would you disagree with that? But more importantly, what do you think about adopting traits from other religions? Because I feel like it doesn't so much matter if people are religious and communist. It's when they start to obsess over those differences, because it seems like it would be much easier to bring in the Islamic banking with no interest, as opposed to some capitalist version of religion, if you're talking about improving things with communism, right?
I don't care what you believe in. You can be any religion just as long as you remember that Jesus Christ is your Lord and Savior.
Well, there you go. Well, I'll answer it this way. When I went to Iran, I noticed that all the men were wearing a ring like this. right? And I actually asked my Iranian hosts about the ring. They told me what it was, and I did some research, and I learned the story behind this ring, and I found that to be fascinating, which is that the Prophet Muhammad, when his followers conquered the Temple of Mecca, the temple in Mecca, it was full of idols, pagan idols, and they smashed those idols and they converted it to being a temple of the one true God. And so to celebrate that victory, the Prophet Muhammad wore a ring with a little piece of one of the idols on his finger. And Shia Muslim men tend to wear an akek ring. Now, I'm not a Shia Muslim, I'm a Christian, but I thought that was a pretty neat story. And it also was very neat because I read a book called it's by Thomas Carlyle, The Heroic, Hero Worship, and Heroes in History. Fascinating book. In that book, he talks about why is it that so many ancient prophets destroyed idols? What's going on there, right? And do we really believe that ancient human beings were just so stupid? They thought they could take a rock and chisel it and that would be God. They'd take a piece of wood and carve it in their backyard and that would be God. And Thomas Carlyle, the Scottish writer, he says no. He says that when those idols were erected, they stood for real truths, right? They were to remind people of real principles and real truths. But as generations went by, people got to the point that those idols stopped really standing for that and they just became part of a routine. People sacrificed before the idol, they bowed before the idol, and the idols were just part of a routine. And so the prophet comes to earth to smash the idols, not to destroy truth, but to do the opposite, to destroy the impediment to truth, to enable people to connect with the truth that those idols once stood for. Those idols started out as standing for truth, but they became a routine and impediment that prevented people from knowing the truth. And so they had to be smashed. And so by smashing the idols, the prophet is restoring people's connection with the real truth that the idols once stood for. And I found that to be a neat story. And I think that if you look at, I almost feel like communism was used that way. They had to destroy the Catholic Church in the countries where they took power. They had to smash the things that were there because they had become just corrupt institutions used by human beings to oppress other people. And now that there has been kind of a sweeping away of these idols and these false entities, now people can reconnect with higher truth, which is based on values like love and compassion and kindness, etc. And so, when we talk about that, I think that's what I would mean when I talk about religiousness. I don't think religiousness now in our time necessarily means you must adopt my faith, you must believe in my holy book. I think it's about standing for the principles that those holy books and those things once stood for, and the power and the spirituality behind those principles. And that's what I would like people to connect to. And I wrote a book about the Houthis. I tried to go to Yemen in 2015. I was part of the Red Crescent Society mission to Yemen. I risked my life on a ship. Yeah, it was 2015, and it created an international incident. You can read, there's Reuters news articles. I was on this ship. The Israelis said we were smuggling weapons, which we were not doing. It was a whole thing. It created a big incident. And it's when I was on that ship that I rediscovered my Christian faith, but I was on a ship full of Shia Muslims. And I look at the Houthis. You look at the Houthis. This is the Houthis in Yemen, Ansarullah. These are the poorest people in the poorest country in the world. And they have taken the world by storm, and they are blocking ships, and they are challenging the world economy. They're shaking the world. How is it that these people? Yemen, 40% of the people in the country don't have electricity in their homes, right? Adult illiteracy is like 1 in 4. This is a really impoverished people who live up there in the mountains, but they are motivated by their faith in God. And they were told by their founder, Hussein al-Houthi, that there would come a time that they would have to stand with the Palestinians when no one else would, and that day would come. And when they started blocking ships, Yemenis from all over the country started going there and getting on the ships and crying. And it was like a moment. It was like the pride. Like, this is the moment where Yemen is the hero of the whole world. Our impoverished country in the mountains, we are standing with the Palestinians. We are holding the world economy hostage to stop the genocide in Gaza. Well, you can't attribute that to materialism. You can't just say, well, this is material forces. There's something spiritual there. There's something deeply spiritual and powerful about the Houthis and what they're doing. And I think that again, that's where I would stray from the classic Marxist materialism, right? I would say there is something spiritual there, and there is something that I guess pushes me in more of an idealist direction when I look at what the Houthis are capable of doing. And so I take the socialist economics, I take anti-imperialism, I take the belief in human progress, I take a lot from Marxism, But I take the eternal rebellion, the cold materialism, the belief that change only comes through conflict, and I let that go. And I think that kind of lays the basis for wokeism. The woke people took the bad from communism. Innovationism, we take the good.
Do you think that these kind of figures like this what's his name, Hussein al-Houthi, and these guys like Farrakhan, for instance? I love Farrakhan because Farrakhan really comes out and he really says the truth. But is this one of these situations where if the shoe was on the other foot, would they end up being just as racist as white people have been for centuries?
Well, I mean, I look up to Minister Farrakhan because when Libya was being bombed and destroyed, I mean, that was a very pivotal moment for me because I was from Ohio, I was living in Cleveland, and I moved to New York City, and I was there during Occupy Wall Street, and Libya, this socialist country in Africa, was being bombed and destroyed, and the left Libya out to dry. And Alex Jones stood with Libya, and Cynthia McKinney, the former congresswoman, who's a friend of mine, who's come on my YouTube channel. I've met her in Russia. We were elections monitors together. She stood with Libya. And Ramsey Clark from the International Action Center, the former attorney general who I worked for, he went to Libya. But the overwhelming majority of the communist and socialist and anarchist groups, they had nothing to say about Libya because the revolution, the so-called revolution in Libya, framed itself as, as an uprising against a dictator, part of the Arab Spring. And when the bombs started dropping and this prosperous socialist country in Africa was destroyed, they did almost nothing about it. And what I do remember is Minister Farrakhan had the biggest rally to support Libya during the 2011 Libyan war. It was called the Millions March in Harlem. And I was there, and Cynthia McKinney was there, and Ramsey Clark was there, and he got thousands and thousands of people in the streets of New York City to stand against Obama and with Gaddafi. So I think that's very admirable. And the Nation of Islam, I mean, they are, I would say, what you might call, I mean, when we talk about liberalism versus illiberalism, they're not communists by any means, right? They're very religious, and they very much have a critique of Marxism and all that, but they are illiberal, meaning that they are people coming together to achieve a collective end, living for a higher purpose. And so I have an admiration for the Nation of Islam. The other thing that I remember is on the anniversary of the Million Man March, like the 10-year anniversary, it was right after Hurricane Katrina. I was in high school. And on C-SPAN, they had the Millions More March, right, which was like the 10-year anniversary. And I watched it, and I was like, I couldn't take my eyes away from the screen because there was on that screen, I mean, he was quoting Mao, and he had the Speaker of the Cuban Parliament, and he was, I mean, it's like, okay, this guy's not a communist, but he's saying all the things that I would like to, I believe, as a communist. And so I don't know, I have admiration for Farrakhan, and I mean, I think that he's had some difficulties, and I think he's he probably is he very strongly opposed to homosexuality, has said things about Jewish folks that I wouldn't say. But I think he plays a force for good. I think he's a force for good in American political discourse. And that's why he's been targeted the way he has, and tarred as an anti-Semite, and tarred as all these things. I mean, maybe he's been insensitive, maybe he said things, but I don't think he's oppressing people. I think he's a force of empowerment in the Black community.
Yeah, I always have my concerns and everything because I had such great hope for, like, Jill Scott Heron even wrote a song where he talked about, fags. And I just was like, why does it always have to end like this? Why can't we all? And I don't know if the shoe is on the other foot, whether or not these liberation organizations are going to do it. But you know what I say? I'll cross that bridge when I get to it. Let them be that opposition force. Let them be that kind of pull their direction. And that's fine. You're right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So look, you're a wonderful guy. We got to have you back on because you're so knowledgeable. You're just like a machine. Put a quarter in. He's just going.
I have some other things we could do.
Well, hey, if you want to ask me more questions, I've got plenty of time here. So
I actually have another segment that I wanted to do.
Okay.
Are you boys and girls ready? This is going to be this is a competition between you and Mike now. It's Marxist trivia. Here we go. All right, got a little graphic there, a little intro. You like that? All right.
Okay, so I'm part of this, right?
You're part of this. So this is between you, Mike, and the chat. Okay, so people everybody in the chat gets fake points, but you two are competing for either.
Caleb is going to beat me just as bad as Eddie did, if not worse.
Right, and this is going to be great. So you got to pick. Do you want the stainless steel cookware, or do you want a trip to South Dakota?
All right, I'm going to South Dakota.
Oh, all right. He's decided, folks. Okay. First question. What? And you guys have to buzz in with the noise. Okay. So you know. All right. What was the name of the philosophical concept Marx developed to explain historical change and social conflict?
Ding, 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 ding.
Yes, Caleb.
That would be dialectical and historical materialism.
Historical materialism it is. Ding, ding,
Crushed
ding, ding. Okay, 100 points to Caleb. Next question. You got the chats. It's a 40-second delay. You guys are slacking.
Oh yeah, they have no chance.
They have no chance. Which work by Marx and Engels first outlined the theory of historical materialism?
Ding ding ding. Is it the
Oh.
German ideology?
Oh, 100 points to our
Hey.
homeboy.
Once in a while.
Home field advantage, I guess. All right. So number 3, what term did Marx use to describe the process by which workers become alienated from the products of their labor?
Ding ding. Is it proletarianization? Hopefully.
No.
You get a shot, Caleb.
I'll read it again. What term did Marx use to describe the process by which workers become alienated from their products of their labor? Now, you can say it in German or you can say it in English.
I don't know the German word. I would say alienation, but that's obviously in the questions. That's not the answer. But yeah, there you go. Go ahead.
So according to this, estrangement. So
okay.
Entfremdung, which I'm in Germany, so I'm qualified to pronounce words. Yeah. All right. No, that's a big whiff. Okay. Number 4, according to Marx, what is the base that determines a society's superstructure? According to Marx, what is the base that determines a society's superstructure? Caleb?
That would be the mode of production.
The mode of production. Correct. That's 200. Nice. Keep track of your scores here. I don't have a digital readout, so I don't know. Number 5. Here, South Dakota, here I come. What did Marx call the final stage of historical development that would emerge from the proletariat revolution?
Ding, ding, ding. That would be the higher stage of communism.
That is correct. We will also would have taken just communism, of course.
Okay.
Number 6. That's 300, I believe. I think he's leaving you in the dust, Mike.
Yeah, he is.
Which philosopher heavily influenced Marx's theory of dialectics?
Ding, ding. Hegel.
Oh, do you know his full name? For extra points?
William Friedrich Hegel. Am I wrong?
You just Bratwurst, Lederhosen, George Wilhelm Friedrich.
Guy in Germany.
Yeah. Yeah, genau. Oh, yeah. What economic concept did Marx use to explain how capitalists extract surplus value from workers?
Ding, ding, ding.
Caleb?
Exploitation.
Ooh, let's read it again. What economic concept did Marx use to explain how capitalists extract surplus value from workers? And you said what?
Exploitation. But I guess
not what I'm looking for. Good answer.
I mean,
Mike?
surplus value, I guess, would be my second,
The process by which they extract the surplus value.
No, it's in the question. That's a weirdly phrased question.
It's a bad question. Well, listen to the actual most important part, the economic concept. What's the concept? What economic concept did Marx use to explain the capitalist extraction plus of value from workers? So,
linen spinning.
Linen spinning.
No, I think that's a joke.
Yeah, that sounds like something that the maid does in a hotel. Labor theory of value.
Okay.
Hey, Notary S in the chat had it, even with the 40-second delay. Good job, Notary.
Oh, so you had a chat. Somebody in the chat. All right.
Yeah, again, it's oddly phrased, but yeah, go on. Yeah.
All right. You're still in the lead, Caleb. Don't worry.
All right.
In the Marxist theory, what term describes the process by which the proletariat develops class consciousness? In Marxist theory, what term describes the process by which the proletariat develops class consciousness?
Well, I don't know that one.
That's interesting. I mean, I know the concept. This is one of these things where I know the concept, but I don't know the buzz phrase. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Sure. I mean, throw out anything you think you might know, but I can also give the chat
a line of march, the proletarianization, like he said before. I mean, there's.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I would just say the organization of the masses, but yeah, I don't know.
That's pretty close. You guys are dancing around, but of course, it's all similar. It's class formation. Class formation.
Okay. Yeah.
Skeptical. I don't know where.
Notary in the chat says the German word
combinations, right? Because he says the workers will then form combinations, then parenthesis trade unions. I mean,
pairs, groups, groupings, romantic.
It's not easy. They're tough ones.
Yeah. whatever you want to call it.
Yeah.
All right, two more. What did Marx call the transitional stage between capitalism and communism?
Ding ding. Socialism.
No.
Oh, damn it.
Ding
It's
ding.
got-
It was
yeah,
not
Caleb,
between capitalism and communism?
Ding.
Yeah.
you dinged in. Go ahead.
Okay, I would say the dictatorship of the proletariat. And
Yeah.
Marx referred to it as the lower stage of communism. It was Lenin who started calling it socialism. So
Damn.
with Marx, it was the
Good point,
higher
Caleb.
stage of communism and the lower stage of communism. Lenin steps in and says, "We'll call the lower stage of communism socialism." So that's why I said the higher stage of communism,
Yeah.
because it's it's
Right.
yeah.
Okay.
No, that was a real tanky head question. That's a good one.
I might be reading these things, but I'm like Alex Trebek. I don't know the answer. I'm just sitting here learning.
Yeah.
Which work by Marx provided a comprehensive critique of political economy and analysis of capitalism? This one's an easy one. Come on, guys. Ding
Yeah,
ding.
Caleb.
Capital, right?
Yeah.
In German?
Das Kapital.
Yeah. Not to be confused with Der Kapital or Die Kapital, but Das Kapital.
Sure. Right.
Which is hard. If you ever come to Germany, that's a hard one. You don't know how.
Well, and so then, right, that's the one that we call Das Kapital is volume 1, right? And then there's the other volumes have different names. There's Theories of Surplus Value, right? That's like volume 4 or 3 or one of them. And then there's the German word for the one that's like volume 4 or whatever. I can't remember the name of it. I've got it up on the shelf over there, but it's there's the different volumes have different names. They don't just call it Capital Volume 1, Volume 2. They have a different name. It's what is it called? Grundrisse, right? That's like volume 3 or 4. There's Theories of Surplus Value, Grundrisse, and I don't remember the other one. But yeah, there's Capital is 4 volumes, but the final 3 were published after Marx died, and they have different names when they were published. So yeah, Capital.
Grund means ground, or it also means basic in German. So the work is considered the foundation of Marx's critique of political economy. Grundrisse.
Grundrisse, yeah.
Yeah. We're moving out of this age where people even read, so it's difficult. Get your books on tape, kids. Put the books on tape, go to the gym.
I've always found Engels much easier to read than Marx. Marx as a writer, I don't think he was a very strong writer, but the concepts were his. But Engels was very much the communicator. And it's kind of interesting, and this is where it gets very, very interesting, right? People make a comparison between Freud and Carl Jung, right? And that Marx, he wrote in a kind of almost a Talmudic style of the polemic, right? If you read the Talmud, it's written as like a polemic, right? Whereas Engels is from a Christian background, so he's writing in a narrative style, kind of like the Christian Gospels. And back in this time, when there was no internet and all of that, and the holy book that you grew up studying had a lot to do with how you phrase things, right? Marx is writing Talmudically as a polemic. Engels is writing in a narrative sense. And Freud is also writing as a polemic, and Carl Jung, who's from a Christian background, is also writing in a narrative sense. And a lot of people find Carl Jung easier to write, and it's interesting to think about. And you can find that parallel of people kind of write based on what they know, what books they have read. I find that very interesting. And Marx, I mean, he was from a Jewish background, but his family was forced to convert to Christianity at a young age, so his father could have a government job. His family was forced to convert to Lutheranism. And many people have argued that Marx probably had some religious training in Judaism because of the Talmudic style, the polemical style of his writing, which I think is an interesting theory.
Yeah. And he had a hankering for pickles. The guy loved pickles.
Really?
Almost killed him, right? He loved salty foods. He loved olives and pickles and everything. Karl Marx, the guy you guys are always talking about, Carlos Marx or whatever his name is. I forget. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, he was an interesting guy for sure. And that his movement proliferated after his death, right? I mean, I believe at his funeral, there were like 7 people, and he was kind of an obscure figure who spent most of his life in poverty. The only job he ever had, he had one job. He worked for the railroad, and he got fired because his writing was too sloppy. And then the only other job he ever had was he was the New York correspondent from London for the New York Tribune. Which was the Republican Party newspaper. It was the newspaper of Horace Greeley, who was like an abolitionist and a socialist in New York City. He had this newspaper called the New York Tribune, and Karl Marx wrote articles for it describing events in London. He was their correspondent. So I tell people Karl Marx worked for the Fox News of the 1860s, the Republican. Right. So
before the party switch, I guess, then.
Yeah, well,
Exactly. Yeah, well, that's what you do. I mean, what else is there? And we're going through it again, like we're going through the age of tabloid rags, and
Yeah, there you
it's
go.
going great.
I have
Going
another
great.
segment we could do if you guys want to do this real quick.
Only if you want to, Mike. Mike's the one who has a life. I'm
Caleb,
just
you have
hanging
time?
out.
Of course, yeah, I'm all good.
All right, cool. Then we can do this thing. I've been reading some of our neoliberal from time to time just to get enraged at the comments, and I think this will be funny. So here's a post on our neoliberal, and they say, "How do you feel when people say that Russia was exploited, hoarded, and looted by Western business interests in the wake of the Soviet Union's collapse? That the '90s in Russia was a neoliberal capitalist hellscape." So I don't know if you guys can see the screen here yet, but we have comments here from people, and so we have.
Read them out, Mike.
User, not a creative user, PT says it was mostly native business interests owned by the former KGB and mob, though. Unless you're considering exploiting, whoring, and looting of Russia, the Pizza Hut ad with Gorbachev. Let's see what else they say here. And jump in any time, Caleb, if you want to respond to any of this or get angry at it, because that's the whole idea here.
Yeah, we're reactionaries here. We get mad at stuff.
The Crass Beagle says, they said the book Red Notice by Bill Browder provides a really interesting account of this from the perspective of an American investor who tried to invest in Russian companies during the post-Soviet privatization wave. If I recall correctly, he points out that there were very few Westerners who even tried to invest in Russia because almost nobody with real capital saw it as a serious opportunity. Browder assessed that shares in newly private companies were massively undervalued, but when he gathered some money from investors and showed up in Russia to buy stocks, he found the whole thing was a corrupt mob scheme. Everyday Russians were given vouchers to acquire stock in state enterprise, but most didn't really understand the value of that promise after generations of communism. They would trade their vouchers to the mob for practically nothing, allowing the mobsters to acquire most of the equity in key Russian industries, which is basically the genesis of the modern Russian oligarchy. Don't you love that, like, Russians after the collapse of the Soviet Union were just like indigenous people exchanging everything for beads because they were just too dumb to know better after communism?
Yeah,
like that, Caleb?
What's interesting now, I mean, this is an example of people saying true things to point to a false conclusion, right? I mean, there were obviously vouchers and stuff like that, but to say that nobody invested in Russia, there's an element of truth in that. What happened after the fall of the Soviet Union, from my understanding, is Western firms would buy factories and just close them down. And that happened in a lot of different places, right? They weren't going to Russia to make money. They were going to Russia to demolish it, to make sure that they didn't produce their own steel. They had to import their steel from the West. To make sure they didn't grow their own crops, they had to import their crops from the West. It was kind of like buying it and shutting it down. So were they going there and starting new enterprises? Of course not. No, they were not doing that. And yeah, people did have vouchers that they got swindled out of. There was a lot of swindling in the period of the fall of the Soviet Union, from what I understand. A lot of pyramid schemes and but a big part of it, I mean, from what I understand, in the 90s, the Russian government couldn't even collect taxes in some instances. They had no ability to force companies to even collect taxes. And that's what Putin was famous for, right? We think of Putin as being this tyrant, but he was a strong man against the rich people, and when rich people wouldn't pay their taxes and would do things that were against the interest of the country, he used the state to go after them and force them to cooperate. And it's like Putin was strong because he went after the rich and powerful, right? And that's one thing. It's kind of the whole thing about, a bully never picks on someone their own size, right? A strong government is a government that goes after the rich and powerful, not a government that goes after people who can't defend themselves, right? I think about Kamala Harris as a prosecutor. She locked up all kinds of low-income people who had a joint or whatever. Putin, yeah, is he a strong man? Absolutely. But his target tended to be billionaires and people that were working against the interests of the country. And yeah, I mean, there's a lot of the people who fled from Russia, like that guy, Bill Browder, who's quoted there.
Mm-hmm.
Bill Browder, he's the grandson of Earl Browder. Earl Browder was the head of the Communist Party in the 1930s, and his wife, Kitty Browder, was a Russian speaker, and they grew up speaking Russian. The kids grew up speaking Russian in the household. And Bill Browder, he worked for Hermitage Capital Management, which was like a firm that worked very closely with BP. And he was in Russia doing business. And my understanding is that he basically found a loophole in the Russian law where he could declare, his accountant found a loophole in the Russian law where he could declare every employee that he had to be disabled. And he could then get a tax break for hiring them. And it was like classic tax fraud. And he got caught and he fled the country, and his accountant went to prison and died in prison. And so, I mean, it's like, I think about Bill Browder. I mean, this guy is your classic white collar criminal. You know, I mean, if you did that in the United States, if you lied and said all of your employees were disabled to get a tax cut and they weren't, you would go to jail for that here too. You know, I mean, if you allege he didn't do that, I mean, that's for you to prove. But I don't see Bill Browder, but Bill Browder is all over CNN. He's the Putin expert. He knows all about it. And I'm thinking, like, you're a corrupt Wall Street guy who is a tax cheat. I'm not impressed, you know? You know.
That's great. I mean, Caleb,
Yeah.
that's a much better answer than I would have given it, with like way more historical context than I could have provided. So thank you for that. I'm glad we had to hear for that one.
Sure. Well, I hope he doesn't sue me.
Yeah.
I have one more I want to read. Just I think it'd be kind of funny. Somebody says, this is MAGA Jihad user on Reddit. They say, it's the Russian stab in the back myth, especially to how it's used to justify the actions of the current Russian government. During Soviet times, the state was obviously the one who provided the living standards of Soviet citizens. But of course, when this state ceased to exist, the standards of those former citizens went down. In Russia, the government handled the transition into a state-controlled economy and living to one based on markets of private interests. Pretty bad, which they fucked up. Economic advisors based in the EU and US were involved, so Russian nationalists often blame the West and Russian oligarchs for basically stabbing the Russian nation in the back. Things stabilized in the 2000s, but the state is still in charge of living standards. For example, the Russian middle class is very much connected to the state, so that's why they support the current government. The president can fuck with elections, but the president doesn't fuck with the pensions. I think when Russians say that, it's often from a historical nationalist perspective to reject Western European ideals. If it isn't capitalism or democracy, it goes all the way back to republicanism and liberalism of the French Revolution. This is the same Russian talking point. Russia can be Russia, but I don't like how the current government uses the quote, remember the 90s, to be so hostile and imperialistic to its neighbors.
Bro, you're using the same argument in America domestically, saying that, oh, welfare makes people dependent. Like, you're an idiot.
This was such a mix of like mishmash. Like, this person contradicts themselves on like every single sentence here, because they're like saying that like Russia was better in the 90s, but also worse. And now people want to go back to the 90s, but it's also better than the 90s. And the state, you know, used to control everything about their living standard, but then didn't with capitalism. But now the state still controls your living standards of Russia. And the Russian president knows not to fuck with that part, but will fuck with everything else except for that one part. It's like, it's such a mishmash, but it's perfect for the American interpretation of what Russia is like, which doesn't have to make sense. It just has to be worse than America in all these crucial ways that they believe.
Yeah. Thoughts, Caleb?
Well, what I would say there is like, okay, let's look at the obvious. Standard of living was rising in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union industrialized, wiped out illiteracy, electrified the country, biggest steel mill, got invaded after in World War II. After World War II, rebuilt the whole country, invented space travel. You know, the achievements are massive. They even had their own home computer system in 1985 that they developed despite, you know, the NATO multilateral treaty that forbid them from getting any higher technology from the West. They basically had to design it themselves. They had a lot of great achievements in terms of raising people's living standards. The 90s comes in, they adopt free market policies, and it's a nightmare. And then Putin comes in and he reasserts state control and things get better. So it's like state control, things are rising, free markets, things get bad. State control, things start to get better, right?
Yeah.
And it's like what I heard in that long, convoluted answer that you read is, it's like, how can we not acknowledge that as the case, right? There's obviously nuances and complicated aspects to all of these things, right? Nothing is ever that simple. But there is a pretty clear, you know, free market neoliberal policies did not work out too well in Russia in the 90s. Things got better when they moved away from it. Things were better before they adopted them. That's pretty clear. And it's like that person is trying their hardest to dance around that and just not acknowledge that as being the reality, which is what I see a lot of. And that's the problem, is that that Western narratives really, they depend on you not doing any research. And that what I see a lot of is that people that actually have to study things, they, you know, if you actually go to, you know, when I went to college, right, it was like the very end of the late Cold War normal, the Iraq War years. College was a place where people learned that there's two sides to every story. People question things, but it was already starting to change. Nowadays, people go to college to learn that you have the party line and you do not question the party line. And if you do, you have no future. It's almost like college is where people get vetted to make sure they don't dissent. You know, I see people who have to study things like this in great depth, but they still, it's like they have to stick to the Western narrative. And it gets very, very hard when they look at the actual data that's in front of them. But if they want to have a career, if they want to succeed in academia, they better not, their data better not say that Russia was bad in the 90s, even though it clearly was, And I see that, people desperately trying to keep the mainstream narrative despite the facts saying otherwise.
There you go. There's the Soviet computer, guys. 1980s home, built probably with no planned obsolescence, just a badass computer.
Yeah. There you go.
I can read those neoliberal replies all day. I do it all the time. I like to post them just to make people angry.
I'm angry now. I'm
somebody else
angry.
was
You know
saying
what? That makes
it
me
didn't happen.
mad.
They were also laughing about, they're saying basically that none of the companies were actually allowed in. The voucher scheme was designed to keep everything in the patriotic hands, which it did. It just handed everything right to the oligarchs. And they're like, what even companies came into Russia? Pizza Hut? Like, that's the whole thing. Everybody knows that commercial. So they're just pretending that other companies didn't come into, like, privatization after the Soviet Union ended was never a thing. Not even a thing.
Yeah. And he did. He took on the oligarchs. And that's the narrative that nobody wants to actually put on. It's like he actually went after the oligarchs.
Yeah.
He didn't enhance them or make them, so big corruption thing he went through, dumping everybody, draining the swamp, as it were. Well, look, I'm going to get out of here. I mean, you guys can hang out all you want, but let's plan to do this again. What do you guys say?
Yeah.
Caleb, you available?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Be in touch. And it was a pleasure. I enjoyed this conversation a lot. It was great.
Mike, be spicy. I'm here to make you laugh, and you're here to educate us on real things. So I appreciate you.
I do my best. Thank you. Bye-bye.
All right, be in touch, buddy. There you go. Caleb Maupin.